Good morning, Southwest Meat Association. My name's Rick Kimbrell, CEO of Start Clean Legacy, LLC. We provide contract cleaning services, detergents, and sanitizers to dozens of SMA members. I'd like to take a moment to thank our team, 400 strong here in the Southwest. For the last 6 months, they've been working harder than ever, just like the men and women in your plants. Without them, we wouldn't be able to serve the food industry. Our team, like yours, has continued to keep grocery store shelves full and stocked, and we're proud of that. Start Clean's honored to be the sponsor of the 64th Annual SMA Convention. I'm so glad we were able to at least meet in this format. The last time I missed an SMA convention was in 1987, the Orlando Convention, when my father, Ray Kimbrell, he either couldn't or wouldn't fork over the money to take us to Florida. I'm thankful that my roots and our Start Clean family roots go back with SMA about as long as this old classic's been on the road. This is the best job I've ever had. Every day we get to build the culture and have the opportunity to create the best job that you've ever had for so many people, helping build careers that coexist with a healthy work-life balance. To do this, we've created the Start Clean Wins Leadership Training Program. This program is mentoring and training all of our existing and future sanitation managers, coaching them to be prepared, consistent, confident, and to follow through as they help manage your food safety. If you see someone walking through your plant with one of these on, stop and encourage them. Again, Start Clean commends all SMA members for their role in putting safe food on the table. The food industry will always be essential. We're proud to be a part of it. I know you are too. Work hard.
Our first speaker this morning is Dr. David Anderson. He is a professor and extension livestock economist in the Department of Agricultural Economics at Texas A&M. He is a frequent speaker at SMA meetings, a long friend of the organization. He always does a great job. Our members always are interested in the latest facts and figures that David brings to us, and we're very excited to have him with us again this morning. Dr. Anderson, you can start sharing your screen now, and the floor is yours.
All right. I see a lot of head nodding. I'll take it. Well, gosh, thanks for inviting me. Jason, I think you said first and only virtual conference. I'm hoping this is the first and only of lots of virtual conferences after being, as you guys can see, I'm sitting at home like a lot of us. So thanks again for inviting me. I sure appreciate the opportunity to be with y'all, and I'm just going to jump right in. When Joe asked me for a title, I said, for some reason I was thinking about, you may have seen the old NFL Films video of Vince Lombardi on the sideline, and clearly something's gone wrong on the field, and he looks around and he yells, "What the hell's going on out there?" And so that was sort of on my mind for some reason. Maybe that quote has just been pretty dang useful over the last several months. So I've just used it for the title, and let's jump right in. I look forward to getting any kind of questions you want. I don't think we can do anything without talking about coronavirus. And I'm going to make a couple of comments about where I see things going because of that. And then we'll talk some beef, pork, and poultry. I hope to focus on, where we're going with a little bit of the things we've seen over the last couple of months, but really try to bring this around to where I think we're headed certainly in livestock markets. Obviously, we all know the path. You guys know it better than most people of coronavirus through our economy, and particularly livestock agriculture from really economic shutdowns, restaurants closing, the stampede at grocery stores, the packing plant slowdowns, and really the way I would characterize that is we have these effects that started at one end, and they are rippling through all of livestock agriculture. And I think of it as you throw a rock in a bathtub or in a pond, you see the ripples, and eventually they hit the shore, they start rippling back. And one of the things I think we will be talking a lot about is these rippling effects of coronavirus as they go all the way from one end, consumers, to livestock producers, and then as those impacts hit, they're going to be coming back through again. And we're going to talk a lot about adjustments. I think a huge amount of where we're headed is how we adjust and try to get by. I think there's a couple of keys that go for really all of our livestock and meat markets. What does economic recovery look like? You read the financial news, talk a lot about V's and W's and L's and all these different shapes of economic recovery. If we got 40 million people unemployed and a shrinking GDP and have been thrust into a recession basically overnight, what does that path of recovery look like? Can we even get restaurants reopened? I think, I think it's pretty useful to think about about demand for meats. One of our problems is that without restaurants, roughly 50% of our food was going to restaurants and 50% through grocery store outlets. Well, we've got a significant portion of that meat demand, of that consumption of meat, is closed. If we only got restaurants, if we're at best back to 50%, and a lot of places not even back there, that's a huge amount of product or meats that aren't, that don't have that outlet. And while we know grocery store sales are up, on balance, we're probably not getting all of what we were going through restaurants. And so I think we're going to struggle with supplies because we began the year, whether we're talking beef, pork, chicken, milk, dairy products, we began the year headed for record meat production this year. And in large parts, those animals got produced. And so we're still going to get to record meat production, yet we don't have some of the outlets for that production. And so I think as we go, thinking about it economically, as we go through our livestock and meat markets, I think everything beyond into our economy as well really hinges on the path of coronavirus and how we recover from that. And so I think that's that's really the overwhelming key. And then, so I'll jump into some livestock markets as well. Cattle and beef, particularly beef and cattle and hogs, we're going to talk a lot about a backlog. I'll show some charts, and kind of get at this backlog. But one of the things weighing on the market for live animals that I think we'll all be dealing with, and I think it's going to take the rest of the year, is, our cattle were produced, but we lose a huge amount of packing plant capacity in April and May, and then we're trying to recover that capacity. Yet those cattle are produced and are on feed. And so, we've got to work off this backlog, and I think that's going to take a while. We've got beef production above a year ago over the last 5 or 6 weeks, as we've, recovered some capacity in the packing side. But in terms of cattle and beef prices, we've certainly seen cattle prices are well below a year ago. Beef prices have declined from the surge. And we think about the cutout value. I think it's likely that beef prices are going to continue to stay low, simply because we've got more production than a year ago, and we don't have that restaurant side fully open. Longer term, I think we are set up for declining cow numbers. Really, our cow herd peaked last year. It was smaller in 2020 than 2019, and I think it's going to be smaller again next year as we look at patterns of cow culling and profitability. I think we're headed for longer term, some declining cow numbers over the next couple of years. And I would make one other comment too, as I look at kind of fundamental cattle markets anyway, it's pretty dry out there. And we know one of the things that moves more cattle to market and cuts our herd is certainly drought. And we've got a portion of particularly the West and parts of Texas that are pretty dry and easing on into some pretty serious drought conditions. And so I think that's something that I don't think has affected our cow numbers yet, but I think it's pretty likely that it will if this continues. So let's jump in with just a few slides. Cattle slaughter. It's clear to see that decline in cattle slaughter in April as plants around the country were closed or forced to slow down. We certainly moved early in the year a lot more cattle than we did a year ago. Even in March, slaughter was up pushing 7%. We moved a lot of animals early, which probably helped us out some in terms of making this backlog smaller. But we think about this in terms of this backlog of cattle. Look at this difference sort of in April at that bottom of 435,000 head a week versus the 660 or 70,000 the year before. You compound that over a bunch of weeks, that gap is really our backlog of animals that are still on feed, that are still headed to be slaughtered. Yet we certainly see a recovery in packing in terms of cattle slaughter numbers back up to basically where we were a year ago in terms of numbers over the last 4 or 5 weeks. I think it's worth pointing out or thinking about, folks had to deal with a lot of changes in plants. And I think one of the things is, we sort of learn by doing, and we figure things out. I think this really highlights the adjustment and figuring things out as to how we're going to operate in a little different climate. But also, if we were going to show a chart of one of the ways we got through this is a lot more Saturday work. If we looked at our Saturday slaughter numbers, they really never declined, and that's another way we've sort of adjusted through some of this. But we've got slaughter back to where we were a year ago, yet we still got that backlog, and the only way we're going to work off the backlog is we got to be able to process even more animals to take care of the backlogs that's there. So I think as we talk about, lower prices, particularly on the live animal side, that backlog is going to weigh on the market for a while. Beef production certainly shows the same thing. We look at about the last 5 or 6 weeks, we've got more beef production than we did a year ago. As slaughter is picked back up, I won't show a chart of weights, but if we looked at dressed weights of cattle, dressed weights have been up 30 to 50 pounds over a year ago every week, and it's been higher than a year ago all year long. And so with that combination of slaughter and weights is certainly pushing beef production above a year ago. And again, just to say it again, we don't have restaurants open to move some of that product. And so I think that's weighing on prices as well. I thought I'd throw this in and just point out that, one of the things going on in terms of a backlog and adjustments happening in the marketplace, those cattle are on feed, and one thing they do every day is eat. And when they eat, they get bigger. And no matter what we kind of do to hold things back, we have weights increasing. We have weights sharply above a year ago. And, really with some of those weights is we've got the percent grading choice and prime above a year ago. We're up to about the 73.5% grading choice, another 10 to 11% grading prime. And so we've got large supplies of high quality, high USDA quality grade beef as well. And so I think one of those things in the market that we're seeing in terms of prices is much larger supplies of choice and prime than we had a year ago, just simply because that's one of those more subtle adjustments going on in the marketplace. Is we have larger supplies of high quality beef than we had a year ago. Another adjustment rolling through is we got this idea of going from slaughter and beef production to cattle on feed. You'll notice really in April and May, we had cattle on feed drop about 5% below a year ago. That's reflective of, as all of this hit and all this turmoil in markets hit, we saw over 20% declines in placements of cattle on feed. I think one of the adjustments and how, as we adjust is it came from kind of two sides. With falling fed cattle prices, there was and a lot of uncertainty out there. There was some reluctance to place cattle into feedlots. And I think we had a lot of cattle producers also that just said, let's just wait and let some of this shake out a little bit before we move. And so that led to 2 months of 20% or more decline in placements, sharply lower cattle on feed. The other way we're going to work through this backlog of cattle is we're going to have a hole here of these animals marking forward that all of a sudden we'll get out here another couple of months and market ready cattle are, we're going to have fewer because of this hole, but we're still going to have that backlog weighing on us a little bit. And I think that's some uncertainty in terms of cattle prices as we get out over the next couple of months. It's just how the timing of that works out. But I think that's a pretty important way we're going to work through this backlog of animals. But we still got a bunch of months to go, I think, on that. You might notice USDA's next cattle on feed report comes out tomorrow afternoon. I do pre-report estimates. I think we're going to have placements up almost 8%, 7.9%. Cattle on feed back just over where we were a year ago. So July 1 would be just barely above that dotted line for July. So we, that decline in placements is really sort of over because, those calves and stocker cattle got produced and they're sooner or later they're coming to feedlots. And so I think that's where we are there. Obviously fed cattle prices have declined pretty sharply. We're down in the mid 90s compared to 110, 111 a year ago. As we look at live animal prices, it's really, we still have capacity, packing capacity where it is. We've got more beef production than a year ago, and we don't have restaurants. And I think that's another adjustment that's rolling through the market, forcing certainly fed cattle prices lower, and some lower than a year ago prices in the calf market as well. The feeder cattle and calf market, I think, really eventually sort of reflects these pressures in the fed cattle market. So I think we've got that going on as well. I got a couple of meat price charts just to highlight a couple of things. I'm going to start with ribeyes. Certainly we see the decline as restaurants close down. So many steaks, middle meats are going to restaurants. We've got this decline in wholesale prices as we lost those markets. Then we've got this huge increase, and this shows up in everything. It's really supply driven. When we had packing plants closed or slowed down and beef production down, yet we still had grocery stores and folks going there, we get this huge run up in prices. And yet now, as we see beef production respond, we've got prices back down to where we were a year ago. So certainly the volatility that we see in the marketplace from that, is pretty obvious to see. I would throw one other thing in here, consideration. I made this comment earlier about being forced into a recession. We know recessions affect people's spending. It affects their income levels, whether they got a job or not. And we know from the Great Recession, people still bought beef, but they bought fewer steaks and more hamburger, more ground beef. And so, as we go forward thinking about recessionary effects on consumer spending, I think we see it really highlighted in some of these different cuts. We look at chucks. Chucks didn't experience that decline early like ribeyes did. Chucks, I would suspect we ground a heck of a lot of those to meet hamburger demands at grocery stores. The stampede at grocery stores was real. I took some pictures at my local store. I guess I used it as a sign that stuff was getting pretty serious, because even the chicken gizzards were gone off the shelf. The gizzards and livers were gone. People got those too. And maybe that's a sign of desperation. I'm not sure. But we see a little bit different pattern with some of these different products, simply because, again, tight supplies as we needed ground beef. And we're back down where we were to begin with. If I used wholesale boneless beef, 90% lean, we continue to have those above a year ago. Really, I think reflecting that ground beef market. And so if we look at cull cow prices on the ranch, cow prices have been above a year ago throughout this. It's actually been a bright spot for the ranch side of things, but really driven by this ground beef market and where we go beyond there. I got, if we think longer term for a bit, I thought I'd show just a January cow inventory. That red line reflects number of beef cows we have annually. You can see we already peaked and sort of turned over in 2020. I suspect when we get to 2021, we'll be talking about a smaller cow herd yet again. And some of the magnitude of that will hinge on drought, but also the magnitude that is, just economically, if we're going, if as these effects roll back down through the industry and we get lower calf prices, we're going to have fewer cows, because that's the economic adjustment to lower prices. And so we're on this longer term trend looking forward of fewer cows, fewer calves, less beef production, and likely some higher prices because of it. A couple comments about hogs and pork. The same backlog of hogs we got on cattle, or the same backlog we have on hogs, and I think we've got a long way to go. We're certainly headed towards a much smaller breeding herd, fewer hogs next year, and less pork production. We've certainly had big exports to China. Longer term, I think we start to see some recovery in their hog numbers, which takes the heat off some of the exports, but still that's a long way to go. I think a path over a number of years. The hog slaughter deal looks a heck of a lot like the cattle. That huge decline as plants closed and slowed the recovery. Hog slaughter back above a year ago, kind of working into that backlog. We know one of the ways, if we think about cattle, we placed fewer cattle. One of the ways hogs certainly are trying to get through the backlog is through euthanizing supplies. Hog producers have certainly cut into their herds by being forced to just dispose of the animals because there was no place for them to go in terms of packing. So I think that cuts into that backlog a little bit, but likely not enough. Market hogs were certainly larger in the June 1 inventory report, really reflecting the backlog. You look at that decline in slaughter versus a year ago, and we were on a path for record production. There was a heck of a lot more market hogs available simply because they hadn't gone to market, because there wasn't any room for them. And so I think this adjustment we'll see is continually working off that backlog. Pork production's above a year ago, so we've got really plentiful supplies of pork as slaughter recovers. Plenty of pork on the shelves. Really all what I might call crushingly low hog prices. As we think about where we're going from here longer term, these kinds of prices, I think, are certainly going to cut into our future hog production, really hitting us as we get into next year. This, pork belly prices have sort of been my poster child in class for price volatility. If I want to give people a description or a picture of price volatility, I show them pork bellies. And this is really the same case. Certainly, volatility in prices from the whole food service side to grocery stores. And yet now as we get into production increasing, we've got prices a little below a year ago. And I think really as we think about this large production, as we work through this backlog, I think is certainly going to be probably pressuring these prices across the board, yet on all of these pork cuts, yet really kind of what happens again in that recession buying and that path of restaurant recovery is pretty important. I just brought pork trimmings. We see exactly the same thing we see in these other cuts, but we're back down about where we were a year ago in terms of trimming prices. We continue to see large sow slaughter. There's a lot of sows going to market and have been for a number of months now. Really indicative that we're shrinking that sow herd and cutting into our future production. And certainly that affects trimming supplies as well. If we look at kind of profitability and hog production, fair to finish, estimated returns, we've turned negative. Really a month there that's like the worst month since we go back to 2013. And so really a decline in profitability. And I think that's going to force us into fewer hogs. And we'll really see the effect coming out next year. Sows farrowing pretty easy over this June-August period in USDA's June hog report, hogs and pigs report. Take a look at that decline in June to August farrowings. If we looked at September to November farrowings, it was also down just like that. So if we don't have those sows farrowing, that's a big enough change. I don't think you make it up on more pigs per litter. And so you think about a production process, this gets us into 2021 with, I think, fewer market hogs and higher prices, simply because there's the profitability has not been there to fuel any kind of expansion, and it's certainly driving contraction. Make a few poultry comments. We all know chickens move a lot faster, and we've certainly seen a quicker production recovery on the broiler side. Not as large production declines, but I think some pretty significant effects on some of the turkey type of products. But broiler chicks, we see production decline, slaughter on cattle and hogs decline. We got, as restaurants, as we lost the food service side of things, or at least a significant chunk of it, the industry, I think it's fair to point out, the industry responded a lot faster on the chicken side of things, on the broiler side. A sharp decline in the number of chicks placed for broiler grow out. Yet if we look at that recovery pattern, now we're back to more chicks being placed than a year ago. So certainly a faster pattern of adjustment happening on the broiler side of things, and production has remained a little bit below a year ago, really because we have not yet seen the effects of more chicks being placed for grow out quite hit that market yet, hit the production side yet. Like in cattle with much bigger weights, one of the things we are seeing on the broiler side is really record large weights per bird on average, and that's helping to, while we see this big decline in chicks placed, we don't see that decline in broiler production, simply because the weights are sufficient to keep the meat production even pretty close to a year ago. So on the chicken side of things, I think we're still headed towards certainly some pretty fast recovery and production a lot closer to a year ago. Although where prices go may pressure some of those future chicks and egg sets later in the year. I think this boneless chicken breast is a chart I've used with folks a lot to talk about, the effects of food service. Every place has a chicken breast, and I think we certainly see the effects of slowdowns, cutting supplies, whether it's reopening or whatever we call that, spike in prices, and now we're back down to where we were a year ago. Leg quarters, though, are way below a year ago. If we look at some of the other cuts, certainly wings are, a restaurant deal, and we now have wing prices rebounding, as we've seen some restaurant rebound as well. But that the effects of, look at some of these cuts on kind of profitability, I think it likely pressures some of that complex going over the next few months. And again, dependent on that path of restaurants and path of economic recovery. Just a little point about turkey production, certainly below a year ago over the last couple of months, but we don't see those big changes compared to the others. Yet we got breast prices well below a year ago. And I think that's just reflective of what we're seeing in, whether it's deli sections, how the product is used. If we looked at whole bird prices, and I don't think I brought that, but whole bird prices are above a year ago. And there's enough production declines to be thinking about whole bird prices later in the year as we get to the holiday driven demand there, with probably a little bit tighter supplies. If I was going to summarize all this, I know I talked pretty fast. I think we've got adjustments that are going to be going on well into next year, particularly on cattle and hogs. Behind this as well, we've got lower feed costs. Farmers have planted about 92 million acres of corn. We already had falling feed costs. We get any kind of normal yields, and we've got feed costs well below a year ago. And again, I think these ongoing recessionary impacts are going to be pretty important for the mix of products and the costs and prices of different cuts. With that, I got nothing but thanks. Thanks for having me. I tried to yak pretty fast and just hit a few high spots and hopefully get to see if we do some questions. So I guess I'll stop sharing my screen now. Is that
Yes, sir.
okay? And heck, we'll
We're getting some questions coming in now.
uh-oh. Fantastic. We can even talk dairy too. I left out slides on dairy, but we can talk a little bit of milk markets and dairy stuff too, if anybody wants.
George Hyde would like to ask, what does the export market look like for the balance of 2020 and 2021?
Oh, good question. You know, in the essence of time, I kicked out all my export charts, but the basic export picture, you know, that's a whole nother area where we've seen adjustments. If we looked at beef exports really collapsed in May. The combination of a lot less beef production, record high prices, and a strong dollar versus some of our competitors really chopped those exports. If we look at some of the preliminary weekly export data, heck, it's starting to pick back up as prices have declined and as production is growing. On the pork side, exports have been running above a year ago. They're still above a year ago, but they were declining over the last couple of months. And really on the pork side, it is China's the big story. We're shipping huge amounts of pork to China, but we've seen some declines to other markets, notably Mexico, for beef and pork. Really, you know, they've got a recession down there. Those record high prices that we had at wholesale and tighter supplies, I think really, and a much weaker peso versus the dollar just made us even less competitive and cut those exports to Mexico even more. You know, I think it's likely, you know, with lower prices, we may sell more. We may see some bump in exports there, but still that recession and currency reflections, I think it's going to keep hurting Mexico. But, you know, I expect exports, quite honestly, to continue to grow, basically. You know, price is going to be attractive to export as prices have come back down, whether we're talking pork or beef. So I you know, other than this adjustment process, you know, I sort of think we're going to keep seeing exports grow through next year as well.
Looks like we got another question.
Are there a higher percent of yield grade 4 and 5 beef cattle, and what is the impact to
50 chemical link.
what?
50 chemical link.
50 chemical link trim values?
So some of the yield, the number ahead with various yield grades, the data is quite honestly not very good anymore because that's really a voluntary reporting. And so the data we get is just a very small subset versus the rest. So I'm not sure I have a good answer for that versus time. I do, you know, you would think with weights being where they are, we would have more of those. If I'd have kept the chart of the 50 chemical lean in there, which I had in my rough draft, you'd see that same sharp increase in prices as our packing capacity declined, but then they dropped like everything else, the 50 lean. And so, I sort of expect with heavier weights, I sort of expect those prices to remain lower simply because we've got a bunch of that production there, particularly as we work through a backlog of bigger, heavier animals.
Any more questions for Dr. Anderson? Well, David, as always, thank you so much. It's always extremely informative, and one thing about it, it's never repetitive because this stuff changes so fast.
Stuff's always different. Well, I just want to say thank you to everybody for inviting me back. I sure appreciate the opportunity to be with y'all, even virtual. I appreciate the chance to be with y'all, and thank you again.
There was one more question came in. If you would like
Oh,
to
great.
address it before you go, is related to the USMCA. Is it helping or hurting?
You know, I guess my thinking on that is it's basically neither one. You know, in a way, it's while there's some changes there. You know, I think it's more on the meat side, gets us sort of back to where we were before. You know, so many of the disruptions that we sort of put in that ball of USMCA, basically, you know, Canada, Mexico, US. There was a whole bunch of tariffs and retaliatory tariffs that put on, and USMCA fixed some other things, but not necessarily those. So I think it's probably more important that we don't get in another one of those tit for tat tariff kind of fights. In a lot of ways, I think it just, I'm not sure there's good or bad to it. I think it just gets us back to some changes, but not a huge amount of change, I don't think. At least particularly in meat markets.
And we have one more question. Do you have any news with China?
That's a pretty broad question. I'm not quite sure where to take that thing. You know, if we're thinking meat in terms of exports, you know, it really is still a growth market, even with coronavirus and all those effects. We see that we're on the beef side, we're exporting a little more to China. But in terms of our overall beef exports, it's still very small. Last month, I think, was about 5 million pounds, and our total exports were 200 million pounds, 180 million pounds, something like that, where we had been about 275 before the effects of coronavirus. And so on the beef side, our exports are really small, are a small portion here. On the pork side, they're huge. They have swamped all of our other export destinations. And with their African swine fever problems and tight supplies and really high prices for pork, you know, I think we'll just keep shipping stuff there. There's a host of other China issues. Those are the two that come to my mind that I think about in evaluating where I think kind of production and prices and exports are going. But if I need to take that in a different direction, let me know.
We just had one more question come in regarding China, talking about ASF. How is ASF influencing the market?
Oh, good. So African swine fever, they've still got it, and they're still struggling to adjust, is how I would put it. Cleaning, you know, really cleaning out facilities, getting breeding stock, starting over to rebuild. Yet, you know, I read a couple of reports just earlier this week detailing their expansion that's going on as they've, you know, bumped up their biosecurity, that they're really working to try to expand, and they're starting to see some expansion, but from very low levels affected by coronavirus, by ASF. And so, you know, I think as that expansion takes hold, certainly prices have been profitable to get them to expand. It's just, can you get the breeding stock? Can you get it in place? And can you get the expansion going with African swine fever still in place? And so, you know, I think longer term, over the next couple of years, we'll talk about their growth again, their expansion in recovering. But then longer term, as they recover, you know, that may very likely slow our rate of growth of exports to China as well, as they try to get back to where they were before.
Well, David, thank you again. We can't thank you enough for taking the time this morning, and you have a great rest of your day. And we're going to move on with the program.
That's great. Thank you very much.
Our world is growing. As population growth continues to rise and wealth increases, so does the demand for food, feed, and fuel. Traditional resources are depleting. and the demand for sustainable ingredients is growing. That's where we come in. We are committed to help meet that demand, as we believe that nature has significantly more to offer than we currently use. We believe that we can maximize the use of natural resources by continuously improving ourselves, our processes, and our products. Giving nature a second life is our second nature. With our roots dating back to the late 19th century, we have evolved from a small rendering company into the world's leading innovative developer and producer of sustainable organic ingredients for a growing population. Our unique broad product and service portfolio is active all over the world, customized for high-end markets and local needs. Each day, our dedicated employees live what we all believe. We serve society by maximizing nature's value so that people stay healthy, homes stay warm, children stay happy, dogs and trucks keep running, and farmers can flourish, not just today, but infinitely. We are Darling Ingredients.